Alright, hey and welcome to example 6. In this tutorial we are gonna take a look at how to create constraints between RBD pieces. Basically what constraints will do is they will constrain pieces together and create like a bond. So when a certain force acts on them, they break and pieces can break apart. But otherwise pieces will stick together. They will make something like this. This is no constraints. Everything just breaks apart once some forces act on it. They will make it work like this. So only when a certain force acts on it, it breaks apart. So here it's still together, and it falls, boom, and it crashes, and it breaks. How it looks in the .NET, it looks like this. This is a constraint network. Starts off, and boom, 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 it breaks. So let's take a look at how to create this. So first of all, we are gonna use a box and we're gonna make some pieces. We're gonna create this into volume, some volume noise, scatter, and we can see that our pieces are kind of nicely scattered here in a very nice fashion, like this. We're gonna put that into our Voronoi object, Voronoi fracture. We're gonna visualize the pieces. In the cut, we're not gonna do anything. In the cluster, we are gonna turn on clustering. We're gonna turn the size up to 0.6, 2, and 0.5. And that's it. No interior detail, nothing to do in the group, and nothing in attributes. So that's it for our Voronoi. Let's just put an exploded view afterwards to see what we're working with. Basically, these are all our pieces, and we are gonna constrain them together. First of all, we're gonna move it up into position. So we move it up a little bit and put it a rotation on it. And next, we are gonna need to create our constraint primitives. So there's a couple of ways to do this, but the one I found most accurate and most useful is to use to connect adjacent pieces. That's its own sub, and it's basically just gonna create this. The default is on this adjacent pieces from points. We're gonna put adjacent pieces from surface points, and it's gonna create this like really cool pattern here. We can turn up the max connections to get a stronger bond. I'm gonna keep it at 1 for now to be it fast, but yeah. Basically, what's important when you do these kind of networks are that the name attribute stays the same. All right, because we are gonna pack these points here, right? We're gonna have 30 packed fragments, and they are gonna have the name piece attribute on a point, which means that the piece is gonna go from piece 0 to piece 29. The same has to go for the points in here, and it does. The great thing about this connect adjacent pieces is that this actually does, instead of having them as a primitive, it kind of packs it for you and then creates the network. So if we see here that we have on this where it's not packed at all, we have 3,790 primitives. Once we use to connect adjacent pieces, we are simply gonna have 30 points with the correct piece attribute or the name attribute, which is going to correspond to these. So these two are the same, which is great because then it's going to work. So we pack the pieces based on the name, using an assemble. We can pack it with a pack sub as well, based on the name. But that means that we are gonna lose the attribute called name, and we don't want to do that. So we're gonna keep the name attribute, and to do that, we just we can either use the assemble sub and just create packed pieces, like by checking this, and that will retain the name attribute, or we can use a packed sub, and it packs it based on name. Like that, by checking this. That means we will have 30 packed pieces. and then we have to transfer the name attribute like that. It will be transferred onto a primitive. That means we're gonna have to promote it as well. And you start to see why we're using a symbol instead, because it's a little bit easier. So we can promote it from primitive to point. Type the name, and now we have it on points. So now we have the name attribute on points and the name attribute on points here as well for the connected instance. Regardless, we are going to use a symbol for this. It does the same thing, but it just makes it convenient for us, or easier. So in here, we're going to check this create packed geometry on the symbol sub. That means that we will retain the name attribute. It will be transferred onto a point attribute. And that's great. Next up, we're going to create the velocity and the W attribute. Just as before, same values. We're going to put that to an out to dop. And this is how we're going to grab our geometry. And then over here, I'm going to go back to the network of primitives that are going to connect the nodes or connect the pieces. On them, we need to actually add an attribute or two string attributes called constraint name and constraint type. The constraint name we're going to reference later on in the .NET, but usually it's a good practice to put the name as the same kind of constraint you want to use. And I'm going to get to that later as well, but there is a couple of different types of constraints. The most common one is a glue constraint, and that's the constraint we're going to use today. Therefore, I'm going to call my constraint name for all of these primitives glue. This means that if we go to geometry spreadsheet, we check in primitive attributes, we're going to find the constraint name for all of these primitives is glue. All right. Then we also want to create a constraint type, also string attribute, a primitive type, a primitive class, a type string. We're going to put all. This is also kind of important to kind of define if it's a rotational, if it's a positional, or if it's all. We're going to do all because that's what we want. And to make sure that it's on there, we're going to check the primitive attributes, and the constraint type is set to all for all primitives. Great. So the reason why we have more primitives than we have points is very simple. Each point can have multiple connections. For example, this point here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 primitives connected to it. But this is a single point. So this is an epicenter or a centroid of one of the pieces that are packed here. Center of this purple piece here. So this is what we want. This is exactly what we want, so that's fine. It's going to work great. But yeah, just so you kind of know what's going on here in this and why it's so many lines but so few points. That's why. Then we're going to put an out constraints example 6 just to know where our constraint network is coming from. So we can locate that later on in the .NET. And that's all we need to do for the sub level. So let's go down to the .NET. Let's check in here. So first of all, we want to import our geometry. It's going to look like this. So it's out to dop6, the geometry. We're going to find it and we're going to import it like this. It looks like this. Nothing happens when I scrub through, obviously. We're going to hook up that to a bullet solver. Again, nothing's going to change there. Right, we have some initial attributes. That's why. Makes sense. So in the initial attribute on the RBD object, or the packed object, we're going to actually inherit velocity and point velocity. That's why it's flying up, because you already are actually grabbing some attributes, but it's going to continue into infinity because nothing is pulling it down and there's no drag or anything like this on it. So yeah. So after the bullet solver, we're going to add a new node called a constraint network. This is where our constraint comes in, right? So in constraint networks, we are gonna go to the constraint network. We can hook it up after the bullet solver. So the first input goes from the bullet solver into the constraint network, to the gray to gray, right? So first tab here, we have data options. That says constraint network. This is where we want to locate our constraint network. So I'm just gonna switch off seeing this geometry from the RBD packed object. Now we're simply gonna see this. So you see, if I go here, if I remove this, I'm just gonna copy it and press delete. We're not gonna see anything. If I now paste it in, we have grabbed our constraint network from SOP level, and it loads in like this. This is how you visualize it. You can switch off the guide here in guide options, but it might be slower if you keep it on if you have a lot of constraints, but for now I'm gonna keep it on. So that's it. That's all you need to do in constraint network. You just need to find the constraints, the primitive constraints networks. That's it. Now we need to define what kind of constraint we need to make. As I said, we're gonna make a glue constraint this time, which means that we are gonna type glue constraint relationship. This will be loading a node called glue constraint relationship. In here, there's a couple of things you can change. Example for strength, how strong these bonds are between the points. The half-life, kind of how long they live, and the propagation rate, how fast any impacts travel through the bonds or the constraints. A little bit of course, I think strength is the most important for now. But yeah, in the guide options you can change the color if you want. It's not so important, but I need to change it here. Regardless, let's delete this. I already added in one here and colored it purple. This one goes into the second input of the constraint. So green to green, basically. So in this, we now can change the strength. I've changed it to 2000. We can change the color of the guides to whatever we want. I'm gonna keep it as red, so 100. Another thing that's really important, because remember, we had this attribute called constraint name, and we named it glue. It's a string, and it's a class primitive. This means that we need to now put the data name in our glue constraint relationship node to glue, because that is the attribute that it's gonna look for. So if you type data name glue, defaultly it comes in as conrel glue. I think it's a better practice to just type glue. So we type, if we don't have anything here, we're not gonna see anything. If we type glue, we're gonna see it. So simple as that. So now we have the network constraint network relationship here and the glue constraint set up, which is great. Our strengths, we have heightened it a little bit to keep the bonds stronger. It needs more force to break them, basically. We can add in a ground plane and the gravity, and we're gonna switch back the display. Now let's see what this looks like. It flies up and it breaks. What happens if I put the strength to be 10,000 instead? Let's see. It's much harder to break this. You need way more force to be able to break the bonds. And if I instead put it to 100, let's see what happens. It breaks way easier. Like here it's not actually broken, but here it does break without even hitting the ground. So it's kind of like a defined look, how you want it to look, kind of what material you're working with, how strong is the material. A rock wouldn't break that easily, but concrete would break easily. So you kind of have to define that, and it's kind of fun to play around, kind of see what kind of looks you can get. But yeah, that is the basics of a constraint relationship network. We're gonna look at this a lot more since it's a very vital part of RBD, but this is just introducing of it. Yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you.